They thought she was powerless, until her husband arrived. Emma Collins was just a black woman driving home with her daughter when two racist cops pulled her over. They laughed in her face, mocked her, and smashed her phone, making sure she had no way to call for help. "Where's your husband now, huh? You people never learn." But then, a black SUV screeched to a stop. Doors slammed open, and the man they underestimated stepped out. Because Emma's husband wasn't just any black man. He was the one person who could end their careers in an instant. Tonight, they messed with the wrong family. The road stretched endlessly ahead, the glow of distant streetlights flickering over the quiet highway. Emma Collins kept both hands firmly on the steering wheel, her fingers tightening just slightly as she glanced in the rearview mirror. Her 7-year-old daughter Ava sat in the back seat, half asleep, her small arms wrapped around her favorite teddy bear. The drive home had been peaceful, the hum of the tires against the pavement almost soothing. Until now. A flash of red and blue lights lit up the night. Emma's stomach dropped. The familiar whirl of sirens pierced the silence, and instinctively she pulled to the side of the road, careful, deliberate. She hadn't been speeding. She hadn't broken any laws. And yet, as she watched the two white officers step out of the patrol car, she felt the old, familiar dread creep up her spine. "Mommy?" Ava's sleepy voice was laced with worry. Emma forced a smile, calm and reassuring. "It's okay, baby. Just stay quiet, all right?" She had taught Ava these lessons early. Hands on the wheel. No sudden movements. Speak clearly. Comply, but never submit. She had hoped her daughter would never have to witness this in real time. But the world had other plans. The sound of heavy boots on asphalt reached her ears before she saw them. Officer Bryant, tall and broad, tapped on her window with a smirk. His partner, Officer Miller, lingered slightly behind, arms crossed. There was no urgency in their posture, no real concern. They weren't here to help. Emma rolled down her window slowly, keeping her movements controlled. "You lost, sweetheart? Or just looking for trouble?" Bryant's tone was mocking, like he already knew the answer. Emma met his gaze without flinching. "Is there a problem, officer?" Bryant let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "License and registration." Emma nodded, reaching for her purse with measured movements. She pulled out her license first, handing it over without hesitation. Ava clutched her teddy bear tighter, her wide eyes flickering between her mother and the officer. Bryant took his time inspecting the ID, holding it longer than necessary before finally looking at the registration. "You live around here?" Emma's jaw tightened. He already had her address in his hands. "Yes, officer. I do." Bryant tilted his head, as if considering something. "Mind stepping out of the vehicle for a second?" Ava's grip on her bear tightened. Emma knew what was happening. There was no reason for this stop, no reason to escalate, unless that was the plan all along. She took a slow breath, steadying herself. This wasn't just a traffic stop. It was a test, and she wasn't about to fail it. The glow of red and blue lights bathed the empty highway in an eerie wash of color. Emma sat rigid in the driver's seat, both hands firmly on the wheel, her pulse quickening. She could hear Ava's small, shaky breath in the back seat, could feel the weight of this moment pressing down on her like an invisible force. Officer Bryant tapped against the window again, the sharp rap, rap, rap sending a tremor of tension through her body. She exhaled slowly, rolling it down, keeping her expression neutral. "You lost, sweetheart? Or just looking for trouble?" His voice was thick with amusement, as if this was nothing more than a joke. Emma met his gaze evenly. "Is there a problem, officer?" Bryant tilted his head, scanning her face like he was searching for something. Fear, maybe. License and registration. Emma reached toward the glove compartment, her movements deliberate, careful. No sudden motions. She had learned long ago how to navigate these situations, how to stay small, stay calm, stay safe. She handed him the documents, watching as he took them without even glancing at them. Instead, he smirked, tapping the edge of her license against his palm. Miller, his partner, leaned against the patrol car a few steps away, arms crossed, watching the exchange like it was a show put on for his entertainment. Bryant chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Women like you should know their place. Emma's grip tightened around the steering wheel. She could feel Ava shifting uneasily in the back seat, her small fingers clutching her teddy bear. Bryant stepped closer, resting a hand on the top of the door. Mind stepping out of the vehicle? Emma kept her face unreadable. May I ask why? Bryant's smirk widened. You may not. Emma hesitated for only a second before unbuckling her seatbelt. She stepped out slowly, feeling the cool night air hit her skin. Miller let out a low whistle. Now there's a good girl. Emma bit down the anger curling in her gut. Bryant circled the car, tapping his flashlight against the side. You sure you're not hiding anything in there? I already gave you my license and registration, she said, her voice even. I have nothing to hide. Miller let out a slow sigh, shaking his head. See, that's the problem. You people always act like you know the rules better than we do. Emma felt her stomach drop at those words. She had been in situations like this before, but something about this was different. More dangerous. Bryant tilted his head, a slow grin spreading across his face. Maybe we should take a look inside just to be sure. Emma's spine stiffened. I don't consent to a search. Bryant let out a low chuckle. Oh, we've got a smart one. Before she could react, his hand shot forward and yanked open the car door. Ava screamed. Emma lunged forward, panic gripping her chest. Hey! You can't do that! Bryant turned back toward her, his smirk never fading. Oh, I can do whatever I want, sweetheart. Miller chuckled. You people always forget that. Emma felt something inside her snap. She had been patient. She had been polite. But this was too far. This is illegal, she snapped. You have no right. Bryant took a slow step toward her. And who's going to stop us? Emma's pulse was racing, but she refused to back down. Not now. Not in front of her daughter. She reached for her phone, her fingers shaking as she swiped at the screen, trying to get to the camera. If she could record this, she could prove everything. But before she could hit record, Bryant knocked it from her hands. The phone hit the pavement with a dull crack, bouncing once before Bryant lifted his boot and crushed it beneath his heel. Emma's heart slammed against her ribs. No phone, no witnesses, no way out. The officers laughed. Looks like you're out of luck, Bryant muttered, shaking his head. Miller smirked, stepping closer. No one's coming to save you. Emma felt her hands curl into fists. They thought she was trapped. They thought she was helpless. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly predicted, was that someone was already on their way. And they were about to regret everything. Ava sobbed quietly, her small fingers gripping Emma's arm so tightly it almost hurt. The fear in her daughter's eyes was more unbearable than anything the officers had done so far. Emma crouched slightly, pressing a reassuring hand over Ava's. Stay strong, baby, she whispered, her voice firm despite the chaos around them. It's going to be okay. But was it? Bryant's smirk grew as he towered over her, rolling his shoulders like he had already won. Miller stepped closer, his hand resting dangerously on the holster of his gun, his expression filled with cruel amusement. Emma had no phone, no witnesses, no way out. And then, in the distance, a low, menacing roar cut through the night, the sound of an approaching engine, fast, powerful, unrelenting. Emma barely had time to register the headlights cutting through the darkness before the black SUV came flying down the road, its tires screeching to a stop just feet away from them. The officers flinched. The air shifted. Emma knew that car. Bryant and Miller turned, hands instinctively moving toward their weapons, but before they could react, the doors of the SUV slammed open. Two men stepped out, and everything changed. Bryant's smirk disappeared. Miller took a small, almost imperceptible step back. Because the man stepping out of the driver's seat wasn't just anyone. He was Marcus Collins, not just Emma's husband, not just a man, but the FBI's internal affairs director. And right now, he was livid. Step away from my wife. His voice was ice cold, cutting through the air like a sharpened blade. Bryant's entire body stiffened. Miller went pale. The arrogance, the smugness, the twisted amusement. Gone. They had no idea who they had been messing with. Miller stammered first. Sir, we were just... Marcus took a slow step forward. His posture radiated power. The authority in his presence was suffocating. Put your hands behind your back. Bryant let out a hollow laugh, trying to play it off, but his hands twitched at his sides. Hey, we were just... Marcus turned his head slightly. Another SUV pulled up. Unmarked. Government plates. More men stepped out. FBI agents. Bryant's confidence shattered in real time. Miller froze. Emma exhaled for the first time in what felt like an eternity. She held Ava close, whispering, "It's over." The men who had tried to strip her of her dignity, who thought they held all the power, who laughed in her face just moments ago. Now, they weren't laughing anymore. Bryant's smirk was gone. Miller's jaw clenched, his hand twitching near his holster. But he didn't dare move. The glow of the SUV's headlights cast long shadows across the pavement, making Marcus Collins look even more imposing as he stepped forward. His cold, calculating gaze locked onto the two officers. Emma stood frozen, holding Ava close as her husband closed the distance between them. She had never seen him like this before. A man on a mission, radiating power, authority, and unshakable control. "I said," Marcus repeated, his voice steady, unwavering, deadly. "Step away from my wife." Bryant exhaled sharply, trying to regain control. "Look, sir, we were just..." Marcus lifted a single finger. "Shut your mouth." Bryant swallowed hard. Miller, still standing slightly behind, made one last attempt to salvage the situation. "We thought she was a suspect," he blurted, his voice cracking slightly. "We were just doing our job." Marcus let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Your job?" He tilted his head slightly. "Your job is to uphold the law, not terrorize innocent women and children in the middle of the night." Neither officer had a response. Behind Marcus, the other SUV doors opened. More men stepped out, their movements smooth and practiced. The unmistakable gold badges on their belts glinted under the streetlights. FBI. Realization dawned on Bryant's face. Wait a second. His eyes darted between Marcus and the approaching agents. "You..." Marcus didn't even flinch. "You had no problem playing judge, jury, and executioner 5 minutes ago," he said coolly. "Now, you answer to me." Bryant's breathing picked up. "This is ridiculous. We didn't even..." "Enough!" Marcus snapped. "Hands behind your backs." Miller's face turned red. "You can't..." "I can. And I am." Marcus took another step closer. "Officer Bryant, Officer Miller, you are under arrest for unlawful detainment, destruction of property, abuse of power, and child endangerment." Bryant's mouth opened and closed, panic flashing in his eyes. "This is a mistake." Marcus gave him a slow, measured look. "You're right. The mistake was thinking you could get away with this." Miller lunged. It was a desperate move, a last-ditch effort to escape, but before he could even get close, one of the FBI agents grabbed him, twisting his arm behind his back and slamming him against the hood of his own patrol car. Ava gasped, gripping Emma's shirt, but Emma pressed a reassuring hand over her daughter's. "It's okay," she whispered. "It's over." Bryant didn't fight. He knew it was useless. Slowly, he raised his hands, his lips pressed into a tight line as another agent snapped the cuffs onto his wrists. The two officers, the ones who thought they were invincible, who laughed in Emma's face, who thought she was powerless, now stood in handcuffs, on their own turf, in front of their own squad car. Justice. As the agents pulled them back toward the SUVs, Miller finally broke. "Come on, man. You can't ruin our careers over this. We didn't even touch her." Marcus turned, his face stone cold. "No. You just threatened her, humiliated her, traumatized a child." He paused, glancing at Ava. His eyes softened just for a second before hardening again as he turned back to Miller. "I'd say you did a fine job of ruining yourselves." Miller screamed in frustration, thrashing against the agents as they shoved him into the vehicle. "This isn't over!" Marcus barely spared him a glance. "Yes, it is." The SUV doors slammed shut. The echoes faded into the night. Emma let out a breath she hadn't even realized she was holding. Marcus finally turned to her. His expression shifted. The ice in his eyes melted slightly as he stepped forward, reaching for her, his hands settling gently on her arms. "You okay?" His voice was low, careful. Emma nodded. "We are now." Ava peeked up at him, eyes wide, unsure. Marcus crouched slightly, reaching out to smooth a hand over her curls. "You okay, sweetheart?" Ava hesitated before nodding quickly, then surprising him by throwing her arms around his neck. Marcus's expression broke completely. He hugged her tight, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "I was scared," Ava whispered. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut for a brief second before whispering back, "Not anymore, baby. You're safe now." Emma wiped at her eyes, exhaustion settling in. It was over. The agents were already talking into their radios, making arrangements, dealing with logistics. Marcus didn't care. His only focus was his family. Emma exhaled. "Let's go home." Marcus nodded, brushing a knuckle gently against her cheek. "Yeah, let's go home." They turned toward their car, but as they did, Marcus paused. His gaze flickered back to the patrol car where Bryant and Miller had stood just moments ago, so sure of their power, so sure they were untouchable. Not anymore. He slid a hand protectively around Emma's waist, keeping her close as he led his family back to the safety they deserved. And with one last glance over his shoulder, he made a silent promise. This would never happen again. Not to his wife. Not to his daughter. Not to anyone. The footage hit the internet like a wildfire. Within hours, news stations aired the dashcam recording, exposing everything. The illegal stop, the threats, the smashed phone, the fear in Ava's voice as her mother was dragged out of the car. Every second of Bryant and Miller's arrogance was now public record, and the world was furious. Social media exploded. Hashtags flooded every platform demanding justice. News commentators replayed the clip on a loop, dissecting every moment, every word. She stayed calm. She did everything right. And yet, this still happened. What if she hadn't recorded this? What if her husband hadn't arrived in time? The outrage was overwhelming. The police department went into full damage control mode. Press conferences were scheduled, officials scrambling to issue statements, desperate to contain the backlash. "We take these allegations very seriously. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave." But it wasn't enough. Not this time. 2 days later, Bryant and Miller were fired. Not just that, they were arrested. Unlawful detainment, abuse of power, destruction of evidence. The same charges they once threw at innocent people, now slapped on their own records. Emma watched it all unfold from her living room. Ava curled up beside her, safe in her mother's arms. Marcus stood near the window, his phone buzzing every few minutes with updates. He barely glanced at it. His focus was here, on his family. Emma wasn't sure what she expected to feel when she saw the mugshots of the two officers plastered across every news site. Satisfaction? Relief? Closure? Instead, all she felt was exhaustion. The fight had been won, but it shouldn't have needed to happen at all. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Marcus answered it, exchanging a few quiet words before stepping aside. A woman stood there, microphone in hand, a cameraman behind her. "Mrs. Collins," the reporter said. "Would you be willing to share your story?" Emma hesitated. Marcus looked at her, his expression unreadable, but she could see the silent question in his eyes. Did she want to do this? Emma looked at Ava, at the small hands still clutching her arm. She thought about every other woman, every other mother who had never gotten the chance to tell their story. She nodded. Outside, cameras flashed. A small crowd had gathered. Emma stepped onto the porch, took a breath, and faced them. The reporter leaned in. "You've become a symbol of resilience. a woman who stood her ground. How does it feel, knowing your story has changed everything? Emma looked past the cameras, past the flashing lights, past the chaos. Her fingers brushed over the cracked screen of her broken phone. She inhaled, her voice steady. It shouldn't have taken this much just to be heard. And the world listened. The flashing cameras were relentless, but Emma stood firm. The reporters pressed in closer, microphones thrust toward her, voices overlapping in a frenzy of questions. Mrs. Collins, how do you feel about the officers being fired? What do you think about their arrest? What message do you have for the police department? Emma took a slow breath, her eyes steady. She had been through hell in the past few days, forced to fight a battle she never should have had to. But standing here now, with the world watching, she wasn't afraid anymore. She had nothing to prove. One reporter stepped forward, lowering his voice just enough to make the question feel heavier than the rest. How does it feel to watch them fall? The crowd hushed, waiting for her answer. Emma didn't hesitate. She looked straight into the camera, her voice calm but unwavering. I didn't bring them down. Their own corruption did. The truth always wins. Silence stretched for a moment. Then, the murmurs started. Camera shutters clicked. Someone in the crowd clapped softly, and before long, applause erupted. Marcus stood at her side, his hand resting gently on the small of her back. Ava clung to her mother's arm, blinking up at her like she was the strongest person in the world. Emma exhaled. It was over. At least, this fight was. Across the city, news stations replayed her words, her face broadcasted on screens in living rooms, bars, and offices. The police department issued another statement, now promising a full investigation into discriminatory practices. Change had begun. But Emma knew the truth. One case wouldn't fix everything. This wasn't just about her. It was about every black woman, every innocent person, every life destroyed by unchecked power. She glanced down at Ava, at the small fingers curled around her wrist, and made a silent promise. This fight isn't over. Because if the truth could win once, it could win again. And she would make sure it did.